In May of 2023, the US economy was once again right on the edge, on the verge of reaching the debt ceiling, and with an agreement between the White House and Congress that took longer than expected, the federal government came very close to default. We talked about it in detail on our sister channel, VisualPolitik. The consequences of this action would have been catastrophic.
Janet Yellen says U.S. default would trigger a global economic recession.
In the end, however, the crisis was averted. On the 27th of May, President Biden announced an agreement with the Republican bloc in Congress to extend the federal government's borrowing limit.
And I think it's a really important step forward, and it takes the threat of catastrophic default off the table, protects our hard-earned and historic economic recovery.
So, all settled? Can the United States be at ease again? And is the danger over? Well, I'm sorry to say, but no. As you can see, debt ceiling extension or not, the United States remains one of the countries with the highest GDP to debt ratios in the world. And not only that, the US economy will face much greater risk in the coming decades. And that's why we on VisualPolitik have asked ourselves a few questions. How could Uncle Sam ever default on his debts? How many times has this happened in the past? Is everything fixed by raising the debt ceiling? How solid are the fiscal checks and balances of the US government? Well, in this video, we're going to answer all of these questions. So, let's get started. But before we do, take a look at this chart. Did you know that almost 9 out of 10 VisualPolitik subscribers are not yet subscribed to our other channel, VisualEconomic? Yes, VisualEconomic, our sister channel. We cover interesting topics such as France's constant blocking of Europe's economic development, how Israel and Taiwan have managed to become technological superpowers, or how tourism affects economic development. And of course, we also address many of the great economic debates of the moment. So, if you are not yet subscribed, don't wait any longer. We'll leave you the link in the description below. And now, let's get cracking. VisualPolitik viewers, while we all recognize that the US economy is a colossus, from time to time, episodes such as the 2008 financial crash or the constant threats of the government running out of money raise a lot of doubts. The latest debt ceiling crisis and the potential cataclysm that could have resulted in the default of an economy whose currency is by far the world's main value reserve is a good example. But wait a moment, because the truth is that this whole issue of debt, budget slippages, and even defaults is not exactly new. Way back in his farewell speech, George Washington himself dedicated a good number of his words to warn his successors of the risk that a financial mismanagement could pose. Take these words from the 19th of September, 1796, for example.
Public credit is a very important source of strength and security. One method of preserving it consists in using it as sparingly as possible, not only by avoiding occasions of expenditure, but by making vigorous efforts in time of peace to discharge the debts which unavoidable wars may have occasioned, not by throwing ungenerously upon posterity the burden which we ourselves ought to bear. George Washington, in his farewell address to the presidency, 19 September 1796.
Since then, and regardless of their political persuasion, virtually all presidents have expressed concern about the enormous risk posed by a growing public debt.
In the decade of the 60s, the federal government spent $57 billion more than it took in taxes.
The federal budget is out of control, and we face runaway deficits of almost $80 billion for this budget year that ends September 30th.
For the 12 years of trickle-down economics, we built a false prosperity on a hollow base as our national debt quadrupled.
I want to speak about the ongoing and increasingly urgent efforts to avoid default and reduce our deficit.
But just remember also, the previous administration doubled the debt in our country. You take all of the presidents that came before, doubled the debt from them.
And yet, despite all these fine words, the truth is that the debt has continued to grow higher and higher unchecked. Since 1940, the debt ceiling has been raised about 90 times. That's a little more than once a year, which is an understatement. This brings the first conclusion to the table. The debt ceiling, in practice, is useless. It has not even managed to prevent president after president from using the federal government's inexhaustible credit card. The question is, why on earth does every US president seem hooked on debt? Where is the country headed? Is it time for a fiscal adjustment? Well, VisualPolitik community, we're going to look at that right now.
Ceiling yes, control no.
As we already told you on our sister channel, Visual Economic, what is now known as the debt ceiling was a control mechanism that came into effect in the year 1917. Until that time, any borrowing by the Treasury had to be explicitly authorized by Congress. To make this procedure much simpler and, at the same time, continue to control the federal government, US politicians took this tool out of their hands, a clear and known limit to the debt that the federal government could take on. In other words, it was a kind of double check. On the one hand, Congress approves the budget, but on the other hand, it prevents the federal government from taking on too much debt. So it is assumed that when preparing the budget, this limit would have to be taken into account. However, as the law was made, so was the trap. Year after year, the White House managed to raise the debt ceiling higher and higher. In the end, what was conceived as a limit became little more than a bad joke. Check this out. As you can see, the 1940 ceiling, set at some $49 billion, is today no more than an insignificant dot on a graph that visually reflects the voracious appetite of the US government. By the end of World War II, the ceiling had increased fivefold, and from then until the 1980s, this ceiling doubled practically every single decade. Of course, hold on one moment, because there is a bit of a catch to this. It is true that the federal government's debt has skyrocketed. However, if we look at the debt to GDP ratio, the same has not been true. Or at least it wasn't for decades. In fact, in the 1980s, the federal debt was as low as 31.7% of GDP. The problem with the debt ceiling is that, when it comes down to it, it serves no purpose except to generate tension. If the budgets are in deficit and the government has to go into debt, the debt ceiling has proven to be a completely useless mechanism, except, and this cannot be ignored, to generate a lot of political tension and, by extension, also economic tension. And so, around 1970, Republican Representative Dick Gephardt pushed for the Gephardt rule, whereby it was understood that if Congress passed a budget that pierced the debt ceiling, it automatically approved the extension of the debt ceiling. To give you an idea, when this rule went into effect, the ceiling was around $830 billion. And when it was finally repealed in 1995, the ceiling was already at $5.5 trillion. Since then, every time the debt approaches the ceiling limit, controversy erupts, and not infrequently, the battle is on between the White House and Congress. Yet in the end, it always ends up moving upwards. 2023 has been a good example of this. In reality, the debt ceiling is only one side of the coin. It is clear that there would be no debt if there were no excessive spending, or at least no spending above the government's own revenue levels. But how far does the problem really go? Do we really have a reason to worry? To what extent is the White House addicted to debt? Well, let's find out.
A checkbook out of control.
VisualPolitik community, I'm pretty sure that the vast majority of you watching this video have some outstanding debt, a credit card or a mortgage, a commercial loan to buy a car, student debt or whatever. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It could even be a good thing. We could, for example, borrow money to open a business or to buy an asset that could give us profitability. In any case, whatever it is for, if we can afford to pay the interest and repay the debt itself with our income, then there'll be no problem. The problem starts when all of this goes down the drain, when we take on so much debt that the numbers just don't balance out. Well, that's what happened to the US federal government, a government that lives with a huge permanent budget geyser. Practically every year that goes by, the checks written by the White House are bigger and bigger, and that is so even in constant terms. Just take a look. So the question we are all wondering is, where does all this money go? And yes, I know what many of you are thinking. It's obvious, Grant, to defense. America spends tons of money on weapons and soldiers. Right? Well, the truth is that this is not really the main expense by far. In fact, in constant dollars, military spending has not grown by that much. It has been virtually stagnant for almost 20 years. But then, why does public spending in the United States grow so much year after year? Where does all that money go? Well, it appears the situation in this case is not very different from that in Europe. The vast majority of the budget increase can be summarized in two words: social spending. Now wait a minute, because the fact is that the federal government spending in terms of GDP remained more or less stable for years in spite of this evolution. In other words, the economy was growing, the government was earning more, and then it directed the vast majority of those resources towards social spending. It even reduced investment in other areas. For example, have you heard of how bad infrastructure is in the United States? Well, that's just one example. The problem is that in recent years, that method no longer seems sufficient. So public spending in terms of GDP has also skyrocketed. Since the beginning of the 21st century, federal government spending has gone from from around 18% to over 30% of GDP. Even without the pandemic, it is quite possible that public spending today would be above 24 or 25% of GDP. But that's not even the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that this level of spending has always been supported by a huge deficit, a budget gap that in 2023 will be over 5% of GDP, and that is making the public debt take off like a rocket. Now wait a minute, do you think we're exaggerating here? Like a rocket? Take a look at this. But this is just the beginning. Here is the data and projections from the Congressional Budget Office. As you can see, in terms of GDP, the weight of the federal debt is expected to increase from around 100% today to almost 200% in the next 30 years. All of this despite the fact that the government revenues are practically at record levels. You see, so far the US government has had one enormous advantage. Since the dollar is the international reserve currency, the demand for public debt from the federal government is enormous. This has made it possible for them to increase their debt so much without interest rates skyrocketing. This has led to situations like this one.
Putin accuses US of living like a parasite on the global economy.
Of course, this has nothing to do with reality, but be that as it may, the question is, how long can such a bubble last? Is such a path really sustainable? Well, let's find out.
The worst of the omens. Is a default possible?
When it comes down to it, the big budget gap that is destroying the public finances of the federal government of the United States, and of many other countries in the world, by the way, has a name. It is Social Security. The progressive aging of the population is a major challenge. So far, the United States has been able to avoid the issue, but will it be able to avoid it for much longer? In the US Social Security system, current revenues do not cover the pensions promised by the government. Nevertheless, year after year, this system closes in positive figures thanks mainly to the Retirement and Survivors Fund and the Disability Fund, two funds that were created in 1939 and 1956, respectively, to accumulate money to meet future Social Security payments. Because yes, in the United States, unlike in other countries, they did save for retirement. At the end of 2022, these two funds had a combined $2.9 trillion in assets saved. The problem is that these funds are expected to run out in a few years. Well, even in the best case scenario, these funds would barely last 15 to 16 years. In the worst case scenario, they could be exhausted in less than a decade. According to the latest projections, we can envisage 3 possible scenarios. That is to say, around 10 years from now, the government will have to take on more and more debt. And keep in mind, this is only the first major challenge that the White House will have to start taking very seriously from now on. It is the first, but not the only one. Meanwhile, the enormous debt that Uncle Sam has already incurred naturally forces him to pay interest. In 2022, for example, the government already had to disburse more than $400 billion just to pay interest. And of course, with interest rates on the way up, everything points to this figure continuing to increase. And it won't just be interest expenses. Social spending will also continue to grow, and to top it off, the growing rivalry with China and the experience in Ukraine are making Washington politicians want to boost their own military spending even further. In other words, the Treasury Department is going to have to juggle a lot of spending. And take note, because a change of government is unlikely to fix anything. In recent decades, the major bipartisan agreement in the United States has been that it is okay to spend more and more. In 2023, we have seen how the lack of agreement on extending the debt ceiling almost led to a default which set off all the alarms. It was fixed with a forward kick that basically delays the problem. Nevertheless, this will be an issue that will be increasingly in the spotlight. The safe haven status of the dollar makes it almost unthinkable that the United States could suspend payments, except in the event of political disagreement. But the dollar's own dominance is based on confidence in the US economy and also on the health of the government's public finances. The former is generally doing well, and the latter is generally going from bad to worse. It won't be today, and maybe not tomorrow either, but sooner or later, and better sooner than later, Washington will have to find a solution. For decades, they have been able to live with the chronic budget gap, but it keeps increasing, and it is already getting too big. VisualPolitik viewers, the US economy is doing reasonably well, but Washington politicians are not doing their part. And that means that in the medium term, many analysts do not rule out that things will become much more tense, especially considering that in a few years, pensions will also have to be financed with debt. There is still time, but this fiscal bomb is undoubtedly another of the great threats facing the United States.
A default would be unprecedented and has the potential to be catastrophic. Credit markets could freeze, the value of the dollar could plummet, US interest rates could skyrocket, the negative spillovers could reverberate around the world, and there might be a financial crisis and recession that could echo the events of 2008 or worse, the potential macroeconomic effect of debt ceiling brinkmanship. U.S. Department of the Treasury, October 2013.
This was the last of our videos of a special series on the threats facing the United States, from the Pentagon's problems to the war with the Chinese economy to Iran and North Korea. I'll leave the link to this playlist in the description below. But having reached this point, it's over to all of you. Do you think Washington will start to take this problem seriously? What would you do to solve it? Will matters fix themselves? How will this whole story end? As always, leave us your answer in the comments below and let's open a respectful debate. And now, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to all of us here at VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. All the best, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.